Dust clung to her shoes, her skirts, even the strands of hair that had slipped loose from the braid she had tied days ago. The road stretched endlessly behind her, a ribbon of dirt. She had walked until her feet ached so fiercely she thought she might collapse. But collapse was not an option. Hunger had been gnawing at her belly for too many days, sharper than any blister or sore muscle. Her name was Clara, though few people called her by it anymore. To most who had passed her by in town, she was just the girl with no money, a figure to be pitied at best or ignored at worst. But Clara carried something inside her that could not be taken dignity. Even in her hunger, even in her worn clothing, there was a straightness to her back, a steadiness in her eyes that spoke of a woman who had not given up. The prairie stretched wide and unforgiving. Late summer heat shimmered on the horizon, and each breath of wind carried the dry scent of hay and dust. Clara's lips were cracked, her throat dry, but it was her empty stomach that pushed her forward. When she spotted the outline of a ranch in the distance, a house weathered by sun, a barn with its doors half open, fences stretching around pasture land, she hesitated. Approaching a stranger's home was always a risk. She had been turned away before, sometimes harshly, sometimes with cruel laughter. But if she didn't ask, she would not eat. And tonight, if she went without food again, she feared she wouldn't have the strength to rise tomorrow. She paused at the wooden gate, hands trembling, heart pounding as though she were about to commit a great sin. The barn was the closest building, its wide doors casting a shadow across the dry ground. She could hear the faint sound of movement inside, tools clinking, the scrape of wood against wood, the steady rhythm of a man at work. Clara swallowed hard and drew in a breath. She rehearsed the words in her mind, simple and honest. Just ask. Offer to work. Don't beg. Don't look too desperate. Yet her insides quaked because she was desperate. She had nothing else to give but her labor. Her boots crunched softly as she stepped forward, closer to the barn. The smell of hay grew stronger, mingled with the faint musk of horses. She stood at the edge of the doorway, her shadow falling inside. Sir, her voice trembled, so soft she nearly didn't hear it herself. The man inside didn't respond at first. He was bent over a harness, strong hands working leather straps with practiced skill. His shirt clung to him with the day's work, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the sun cutting across the sharp lines of his shoulders. Clara steadied herself, lifted her chin a fraction, and tried again. Sir, I wondered if I might clean your barn in exchange for a plate of food. The words spilled out quickly, like a secret she had been holding too long. She gripped her hands together, pressing her fingers tightly so he wouldn't see them shake. For a moment, there was only silence. Her chest tightened, expecting rejection. Perhaps he would laugh at her. Perhaps he would tell her to move on, that he had nothing to give. Perhaps he would be cruel. But then, slowly, he straightened. The rancher turned toward her, and the moment his eyes met hers, something shifted. His gaze, a piercing blue-gray like storm clouds gathering, locked on hers as though he had been struck still. She felt the weight of it, heavy but not harsh. His face, lined with years of labor and solitude, softened in an instant, as though he had forgotten how to speak. Clara's breath caught. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she didn't feel invisible. His eyes saw her, not just the dust on her clothes, not just the hunger in her thin frame, but her. The barn seemed to still around them. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunbeam that cut through the open door. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass. But inside, silence stretched, taut and fragile. She almost lowered her gaze. Suddenly, self-conscious beneath the intensity of his stare, but something in her refused to shrink back. She held his eyes, though her pulse hammered in her throat. The rancher's chest rose with a deep breath, as though grounding himself. His hands, rough from rope and reins, fell to his sides. He did not move closer, not yet, but the look in his eyes had changed, softened, deepened, as though he saw a story in her presence that he hadn't expected. Clara swallowed, her voice breaking the silence once more. I don't want charity. Just a meal. I'll work for it. I can clean, mend, whatever you need. But still he did not answer immediately. Because in that first moment, in that first meeting of eyes, something had already shifted inside him. His heart, long quiet in its loneliness, had stumbled, startled awake, as if it remembered what it had forgotten, the way it felt to care. And Clara, though she didn't know it yet, had just stepped into the doorway of a new beginning. Elias Carter had been working since dawn. Sweat ran down his brow as he tightened the leather harness in his hands, the sun's heat pressing down with a merciless weight. Every day seemed to stretch longer than the last, as if the land itself was testing how much more he could take. The ranch had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that. Elias had inherited it with pride, but also with a crushing weight. Years of drought had stolen the grass from his pastures. Storms had torn down fences faster than he could repair them, and the markets paid less for cattle than ever before. He had fought to keep the place alive. Every sunrise, a new battle against debt and loneliness. Most men would have sold and left by now, but Elias wasn't most men. Stubbornness ran through his blood like iron. This ranch was the last piece of his family he had left, and he would not give it up, not to the bankers, not to the land, not to fate itself. But that didn't make the nights easier. When he sat by the fire alone, with only silence to answer him, the weight of it gnawed at him. There had been a time, years ago, when he had imagined a home filled with laughter, a wife, maybe children, but those dreams had faded long ago. Women in town didn't see him as much of a prospect anymore, not with a ranch on the edge of ruin and a man who carried more burdens than words. So he worked. Work was simpler than feelings, than dreams. If his hands were busy, his mind could rest, at least for a while. That morning had been like any other repairs in the barn. Chores that never ended. The hum of loneliness stretching around him like the vast, empty prairie. He hadn't expected anyone to come down that dirt road. Folks rarely visited, unless it was a bill collector or a neighbor needing help. And then, a voice. Soft, uncertain. At first, he thought he'd imagined it. He kept working, his head bent low, until it came again, trembling, quiet, but real. When he finally turned, his world shifted. She stood in the doorway, thin and pale beneath the layers of dust clinging to her clothes. Her eyes, though shadowed by hunger and weariness, held a light he couldn't look away from. She wasn't like the women in town who looked at him with pity or dismissal. No, this woman looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope, as if she stood on the edge of breaking but refused to fall. Her words came quickly, almost tumbling over each other. She wanted to clean his barn in exchange for food. Not charity, not pity. She wanted to work. Ilias's chest tightened. He had seen desperation before, men begging for work, folks driven near mad by hunger. But this was different. This wasn't someone broken. This was someone holding on with everything she had left. And in that moment, he froze. He should have spoken. He should have told her to come inside, to eat, that she didn't need to offer anything. But his tongue wouldn't move. His heart, quiet for so many years, stumbled painfully in his chest, because the way she looked at him, the way her voice shook but didn't break, stirred something he hadn't felt in so long. He had almost forgotten it existed. Compassion. And something else, something dangerous. Something like longing. The barn seemed to hush around them, the dust settling mid-air, the horses shifting quietly in their stalls, as if they, too, felt the moment hang heavy. Elias gripped the harness in his hands, so tightly the leather creaked. He didn't trust himself to speak, not right away. He studied her, this stranger on his land, trying to understand why his chest ached with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. She was just a girl in need of food, that was all. He had given food, 2 drifters before he could send her on her way once her belly was full. That was the reasonable thing, the safe thing. But reason faltered when her eyes met his. There was resilience there, buried beneath exhaustion, like embers that refused to die out. And for a fleeting moment, Elias saw himself reflected in them, the same fight, the same quiet stubbornness to endure. His throat worked as he drew in a slow breath, trying to steady himself. He had been alone so long that he had learned to carry his burdens silently. But as he looked at her, a thought whispered, through him, unbidden and dangerous, maybe I don't have to be alone forever. He shoved it down, hard. Dreams like that were luxuries, and luxuries had no place on a failing ranch. And yet, he couldn't look away. Standing in his barn, this woman with trembling hands and hungry eyes had just unsettled the man who had withstood storms, debts, and endless nights alone. Elias Carter, the man who thought he had nothing left to feel, found his heart refusing to obey, and he knew life on this ranch had just changed. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The silence in the barn was so deep Clara could hear her own heartbeat drumming in her ears. She stood in the doorway, her hands clasped together to keep from fidgeting, dust clinging to her clothes, her body trembling from exhaustion and hunger. And still, she stood tall, forcing herself not to shrink back beneath the weight of the rancher's stare. Elias Carter had turned at last, his broad frame casting a long shadow in the sunlight filtering through the barn slats, his eyes locked with hers, and Clara felt pinned in place. He didn't look at her like most men did, with judgment, disdain, or idle curiosity. His gaze was sharper, searching, almost as though he was trying to read her soul. Clara's breath caught. She had faced rejection before. She had been turned away from porches, told to move along by shopkeepers, sneered at by women who saw her hunger as shameful weakness. But this silence was different. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dismissive. If anything, it was unsettling because it felt heavy, as though he were seeing far more of her than she intended to show. Her throat was dry, but she forced herself to speak again, her voice stronger this time. I don't want charity. Just a plate of food. I can work for it. I'll clean your barn, mend your clothes, scrub your floors, anything you need. Elias blinked, as though her words pulled him back to the present. His lips parted, but no words came. He shifted slightly, as if unsure whether to step toward her or keep his distance. The hesitation in his eyes wasn't the coldness of a man preparing to reject her, it was the bewilderment of someone caught off guard. Clara's chest tightened. She expected him to laugh, to shake his head, to tell her he had no need for stray women wandering onto his land. The shame burned in her cheeks at even asking. But hunger pushed her to stand her ground, and she lifted her chin just a little higher. Meeting his gaze without flinching, it was Elias who finally broke the silence. His voice, low and rough from disuse. "You'd clean my barn for a plate of food?" Clara nodded, clutching the fabric of her skirt to steady herself. "Yes, just food. Nothing more." Something flickered in his eyes, something that wasn't pity, but wasn't quite belief either. He studied her, as though weighing her words, her resolve, and perhaps her spirit itself. "You look worn near to breaking," he murmured, almost to himself. Clara stiffened. "I can work." The firmness in her voice surprised even her. She wanted him to know she wasn't weak, that she still had fight in her, even if her stomach was empty and her body tired. Elias's gaze softened, the storm gray in his eyes shifting, like clouds breaking to reveal light behind them. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and in that silence, Clara felt an odd warmth stir in her chest. It wasn't comfort exactly, it was something she couldn't name, but it made her knees tremble in a different way than hunger did. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right." Relief crashed through her, though she kept her face composed. He gestured toward the house in the distance, a modest, weather-worn structure sitting beyond the corral. "Food first," he said firmly, as though it were not up for debate. "Work after." Clara hesitated. She wanted to argue, to insist she wouldn't take a bite until she'd earned it, but her stomach betrayed her with a loud, painful growl that filled the quiet barn. Heat rushed to her cheeks, and she lowered her eyes in embarrassment. For the first time, she heard a sound from him, deep, quiet, almost like a chuckle. Not mocking, not cruel, but a soft, genuine sound that made her chest ache in a way hunger never had. He took a step closer then, slow and careful, like a man approaching a skittish horse. Clara held her ground, though every instinct told her to retreat. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to touch, only tilted his head slightly as he spoke. "You've got grit," he said simply. "I can see it in your eyes." Clara blinked, caught off guard. No one had ever said that to her before. People saw her hunger, her worn shoes, her ragged clothes, but never her strength. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, and for a fleeting second, she felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. Elias gestured toward the house again, his voice steady now. "Come on, let's get you fed. Then we'll talk about work." Clara nodded, though her legs felt heavy as she followed him out of the barn. She glanced back once, at the place where she had stood trembling moments before, realizing something had shifted. She had come here only seeking food, expecting little else. But in the way he looked at her, steady, quiet, almost reverent, she sensed this meeting was more than chance. For Elias Touvier felt charged, alive with something he hadn't let himself feel in years. He didn't know who she truly was, or what storms had brought her here. But as their eyes met once more in the sunlight, his heart, long frozen in solitude, beat with a strange, unshakable certainty. This was only the beginning. The walk from the barn to the house was short, yet Clara felt every step like it was miles. Her legs wobbled beneath her skirt, threatening to give way, but she forced herself to keep her back straight. She didn't want this man, this stranger with storm-gray eyes, to see just how weak she truly was. Elias walked a few paces ahead, his stride steady, his shoulders broad beneath his worn shirt. He didn't say much, only glanced over his shoulder, once to be sure she was still following. She was grateful for the silence. Words were dangerous when spoken at the wrong moment. Better to keep her head down, her eyes fixed on the small, weather-beaten house that grew closer with each step. When they reached the porch, Elias paused, pulling open the creaking door and holding it for her. Clara hesitated, the threshold before her suddenly feeling like a line she wasn't sure she should cross. She had spent weeks, months even, drifting between alleys, camps, and barns that never belonged to her. Crossing into this house felt different. It felt like stepping into someone's life, and she wasn't sure she belonged in anyone's life anymore. But the smell of warmth beckoned her, the faint aroma of bread, the lingering scent of coffee, and something else. Home. Her stomach clenched painfully, and shame burned her cheeks. She dipped her head in thanks and stepped inside. The interior was simple, worn but clean. Wooden floors scuffed from years of boots, a table built solid and heavy in the center, a cast-iron stove tucked against the far wall. There was no woman's touch here, no lace curtains, no flowers, no gentle decorations. The house spoke of utility, of a man who lived by necessity, not comfort. "Sit," Elias said, motioning toward the table. His voice was firm, but not harsh, like the voice of a man used to being obeyed. Clara obeyed, lowering herself onto the chair with care, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. She wanted to offer again, "Let me work first, please," but before she could, Elias had moved to the stove. He ladled stew from a pot, the rich, savory smell filling the room until her mouth watered painfully. He placed a bowl before her, along with a thick slice of bread, steam still curling from its crust. Clara stared at it, her throat tightening. The last real meal she had eaten felt like another lifetime. "Eat," Elias instructed, his tone leaving No room for protest. I should, she faltered, the words catching in her throat. She wanted to insist on working first, on proving she wasn't taking advantage of his kindness. But her stomach betrayed her, growling so loudly the sound echoed off the wooden walls. Heat flooded her cheeks. Elias's expression softened. Food first, he repeated gently. The work wait. Clara picked up the spoon with trembling fingers. She took one cautious bite, the warmth of the stew flooding her body, rich with potatoes and carrots and just enough meat to give it flavor. The taste nearly undid her. She blinked rapidly, willing the sting in her eyes away, and forced herself to eat slowly, carefully, as though she wasn't starving. Elias sat across from her, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching quietly. He didn't eat. He didn't press her with questions. He simply let her have the moment. Clara was acutely aware of his gaze, steady but not unkind. It unnerved her, how he seemed to look past the dirt on her hands and the wear on her clothes, as though he saw something more. She wasn't used to being seen at all, let alone like this. When the bowl was empty, Clara set the spoon down with careful precision. She folded her hands in her lap again, staring at the wood grain of the table, unsure what to say. Gratitude sat heavy in her chest, but words felt too small, too fragile to carry the weight of what this meal meant. Elias broke the silence. Where you from? Clara stiffened. Questions were dangerous. Answers even more so. She kept her eyes lowered, nowhere worth mentioning. He studied her for a long moment but didn't press. Instead, he nodded once, as though her answer was enough. You'll work when you're ready, he said, not before. Her head lifted then, eyes meeting his, in surprise. Most men demanded more answers, more proof of worth, more repayment. But this man, for reasons she couldn't fathom, offered patience instead. And in that moment, something small but profound cracked open inside her chest. She had asked for food in exchange for labor. What she had received was dignity, freely given. For Elias too, the moment lingered. Watching her eat stirred something deep within him. He had given food to others before, but it had never felt like this. There was something about her pride, despite her hunger, her determination despite her weariness, that pulled at him in ways he didn't yet understand. As the last rays of sun spilled through the window, casting warm light across the table, their eyes met once more. Neither spoke, yet something passed between them, fragile, tentative, but undeniable. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the first flicker of trust, and for both of them, trust was rarer and more precious than gold. The morning light slanted through the cracks in the barn walls, casting long golden beams across the dusty floor. Clara stood at the entrance, a broom in one hand, a rag slung over her shoulder. Her stomach still hummed with the memory of the meal Elias had given her the night before. Her first proper meal in longer than she cared to admit. The warmth of it had seeped into her bones, giving her just enough strength to face the day. This barn, she thought, was more than just a place for animals. It was the heart of his ranch, the space where sweat, time, and care kept the place alive. She could see the marks of hard labor everywhere, the neatly coiled ropes, the carefully hung tools, the worn but well-mended tack. Yet despite Elias's diligence, the barn bore the wear of one man carrying too much alone. Dust coated every surface, cobwebs hung in corners, and the floor had layers of dirt packed down from years of hooves and boots. Clara tightened her grip on the broom. This, at least, she could do. Work was the one currency she had left, and she intended to pay him back for his kindness. She began at the stalls, sweeping out old hay and manure with methodical strokes. The horses shifted and snorted, curious about this new presence, but they settled quickly as though sensing her steady hand. The barn cats prowled around her feet, weaving between her legs as if they had already decided she belonged. Every push of the broom, every rag dragged across wood, seemed to scrape away, not just the dirt of the barn, but also the weight pressing down on her spirit. Clara worked with quiet determination, the rhythm of labor grounding her. She didn't have to think about where she had come from or where she might go tomorrow. All that mattered was the work in front of her and the unspoken promise that it might secure her a place here, even if just for a little while. Unbeknownst to her, Elias watched from the doorway. He had risen early, as he always did, expecting to find her asleep in the spare room where he'd told her to rest. Instead, he found her already at work, her slender frame bent to the task with surprising strength. He leaned against the post, arms crossed, his face unreadable, but his mind far from still. Most people, given a meal and a roof, would have delayed. They would have rested, maybe even asked for more. But not her. She was working as though her life depended on it, and perhaps it did. Elias's eyes followed the sure movements of her hands, the way she refused to pause even when her shoulders ached or her brow dampened with sweat. He felt something stir in him, admiration, yes, but also guilt. He had nearly forgotten what it was like to have someone else here, another soul filling the empty spaces of his ranch. Clara didn't notice his presence at first. She was too focused, lost in the rhythm of sweeping and scrubbing. But when she finally glanced up and caught sight of him, her cheeks flushed, and she quickly straightened, clutching the broom as though she'd been caught stealing. I was just finishing this stall, she stammered, her voice uncertain. I wanted to repay you for the food. Elias shook his head, his expression unreadable. You don't owe me. Clara stiffened. I do. Her tone carried quiet conviction, a sharpness born of pride. For a long moment, they held each other's gaze. Then Elias exhaled slowly, the corner of his mouth twitching with something that wasn't quite a smile. Then keep at it, if it eases your mind. Clara lowered her eyes again, nodding. Relief washed over her, though she couldn't explain why. She turned back to her work, but his presence lingered. She could feel his gaze on her as she swept, not heavy with judgment but steady, almost protective. Hours passed like that, her working, him occasionally stepping in to lend a hand, but mostly letting her lead. By the time the sun had climbed high, the barn looked transformed. The floor was swept clean, the tools polished, the tack arranged in neat rows. Even the air felt lighter, the stale smell of dust replaced by fresh hay. Clara leaned against her broom, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. She was exhausted, but for the first time in months, she felt a sense of accomplishment. Elias stepped forward, surveying the barn with a slow nod. You've done more in a morning than I've managed in weeks. His voice carried no just. With simple truth, Clara's lips curved in the faintest smile, a smile that surprised even her. Work keeps me steady. His gaze softened at that. Ain't many left who think that way. For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them again, thick with something unspoken. Clara shifted under his stare, but she didn't look away. And Elias, for the first time in years, felt the heavy loneliness of his ranch lift just a little. He realized then that this woman, worn and weary though she was, carried more than hunger with her. She carried strength, and that strength had already begun to breathe new life into the quiet corners of his world. The day's labor ended with the sky painted in soft shades of lavender and gold. The prairie wind had gentled, carrying with it the earthy scent of grass and the faint smoke from Elias's chimney. Inside the small ranch house, Clara sat near the fire, her hands folded in her lap, the glow of the flames casting flickering shadows across her face. She was tired to her bones. Her arms ached from scrubbing and sweeping, but it was a good kind of ache, the kind that told her she had earned her supper. Elias had insisted she sit while he ladled stew into 2 bowls. She had protested, but he only gave her that steady look of his, the one that silenced her arguments without a word. Now, the two of them sat opposite each other at the heavy wooden table. Clara ate slowly, savoring each bite, while Elias sipped his coffee in quiet contemplation. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, not like the ones she had endured with strangers on the road. This silence felt safe, as though words weren't demanded, only offered when they were ready. But Clara knew that kindness came with curiosity. She had seen the questions lingering in Elias's eyes ever since she'd stepped onto his land. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why had she wandered so far? Questions she had no good answers for, at least, not ones she wanted to share. When the bowls were empty and the fire had burned lower, Elias leaned back in his chair, studying her with that same quiet intensity. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even. You work harder than most. That tells me something. Clara stiffened slightly, her eyes dropping to the table. Work is all I have left. There was a pause, long enough for the crackle of the fire to fill the space between them. Then Elias spoke again, softer this time, and before. What did you have then? The question cut sharper than she expected. Clara's fingers twisted in her lap, her throat tightening. She hadn't planned to tell him anything. Better to keep her past locked away where it couldn't hurt her anymore. But something about the way he waited, not pressing, not demanding, just listening, broke through her defenses. She drew in a shaky breath. Family, she whispered. Elias's brows drew together, but he didn't interrupt. They were all I had, Clara continued, her voice thin. But they didn't see me as worth keeping. My brother took what little money I had left. My sister told me I was a burden. My father, she stopped, the word lodging in her throat like a stone, her hands clenched tighter. My father made it clear I wasn't wanted anymore. Said I was better off gone. The fire popped, a spark leaping up and fading into the chimney. Clara stared into the flames, her eyes burning, though no tears fell. She had cried enough on the road, cried herself empty. Elias's jaw tightened, the muscles working as he absorbed her words. He didn't speak immediately, and Clara was grateful. Pity was the one thing she couldn't stomach. Finally, he said quietly, you didn't deserve that. Clara let out a brittle laugh, though there was no humor in it. Maybe I did. Maybe I was too much trouble. Maybe they were right. Elias leaned forward, his eyes catching hers across the table. The firelight glinted off the storm-gray depths, steady and unwavering. No one deserves to be thrown away. Not family, not anyone. The conviction in his voice startled her. She had expected indifference, maybe polite silence. But what she heard instead was something fiercer, something like anger on her behalf. Her breath caught, her chest tightening with an unfamiliar ache. No one had spoken for her in years. No one had defended her. not since her mother died when she was just a girl. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fire crackled, the night pressed in against the windows, and something fragile but undeniable stretched between them. Clara looked away first, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you? What do you have?" Ilyas's gaze dropped to his hands, rough and scarred from years of work. His voice was steady, but there was a weariness beneath it. "This land, these walls, a herd that barely keeps me afloat. That's all." She tilted her head, watching him, and no one to share it with. His lips pressed into a thin line. For a heartbeat, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said simply, "Not anymore." The weight of those words settled between them. Clara didn't press. She didn't need to. She understood loneliness when she heard it. The fire burned lower, the silence wrapping around them once again. This time it was different. Not empty, not sharp, but full of unspoken truths. They had both revealed pieces of themselves, pieces too raw to offer lightly. And in that sharing, a fragile bond had begun to take root. Clara folded her hands tighter. In her lap, steadying herself, she had told him more than she had meant to, but strangely, she didn't regret it. For the first time in a long while, she felt like someone had truly listened, and Elias, staring into the fire with her words echoing in his mind, realized something he hadn't let himself feel in years. He wanted to keep listening. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Clara rose early each morning, long before the sun had stretched itself over the wide prairie. She helped stoke the fire, swept the porch, and hung the wash on the line where the dawn breeze could dry it. Elias often found her humming softly while she worked, though she never realized she did. Her voice light, almost fragile, a tune that stirred something deep in him, like a memory he had buried long ago. At first, Elias tried to insist she rest more, that she had no obligation to work so hard. But Clara would only smile faintly, shake her head, and say, "Work keeps me steady. It makes me feel useful." And though he worried about the thinness of her frame and the weariness in her eyes, he didn't argue again. Instead, he found himself quietly watching her. The way her determination gave her an unexpected grace. One afternoon, after the two had finished repairing the chicken coop together, Elias noticed Clara brushing strands of hair from her forehead. With the back of her hand, he held out a clean rag. "Here," he said simply. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his calloused palm for the briefest instant. A spark shot through him, quick and uninvited. Clara, too, seemed to pause just long enough for their eyes to meet before she dropped her gaze and mumbled a thank-you. It was such a small thing, but Elias felt the weight of it long after. Clara, for her part, began to see Elias differently. With each passing day, he was quiet, yes, and sometimes stern, but beneath that hard exterior was a man of steady kindness. She saw it in the way he tended his horses, speaking to them in low, reassuring tones. She saw it in the way he set aside the choicest pieces of food for her, pretending it was nothing. She even saw it in the way he fixed the broken latch on her room door without mentioning it, as though he simply wanted her to feel safe. One evening, when the prairie sky glowed pink and gold, Clara carried a basket of laundry back from the line. Elias was mending a fence nearby, his sleeves rolled up, the muscles in his forearms flexing with each movement. He looked up at her, squinting against the sun, and for a moment their eyes caught. Something passed between them then, something. Neither spoke aloud. Clara looked away quickly, but her cheeks burned, and her heart raced in a way she hadn't felt in years. The bond grew in little moments. Moments that seemed almost ordinary but carried weight all the same, like the time Elias caught her humming while cooking and asked, "What song is that?" Clara had blinked in surprise, then laughed nervously. "I don't even know. Something my mama used to sing." Elias didn't press, but the sound of her laugh stayed with him long after. Or the afternoon they rode out together to check the cattle, Clara clung nervously to the saddle, clearly unused to riding, until Elias guided his horse closer. "Hold steady," he said, his voice firm but reassuring. When the horse jolted unexpectedly, Clara gasped, and Elias reached out, steadying her with a strong hand at her arm. She met his eyes, and the look there for protectiveness left her breathless. That night, after supper, Clara found herself sitting on the porch, staring at the stars. The sky stretched endless above her, more stars than she had ever seen back in the small town she came from. She felt Elias step onto the porch behind her, his boots scuffing against the wood. "Beautiful out here," she whispered, not looking at him. "Always is," he answered, his voice low. He leaned against the porch post, crossing his arms as he followed her gaze skyward. After a moment, he added, "Never gets easier," though Clara turned slightly, puzzled. "What doesn't?" "The quiet," he said simply. There was no bitterness in his tone, only a matter-of-fact wariness that tugged at her heart. She understood, all too well, how silence could be both a comfort and a curse. Without thinking, Clara said softly, "Then maybe it won't be so quiet anymore." The words hung in the night air, heavier than she meant them to. She looked down quickly, embarrassed, her fingers twisting in her skirt. But Elias only studied her, his expression unreadable, his eyes searching hers as if weighing something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Finally, he said, "I'd like that." The bond between them wasn't spoken aloud, not yet, but it was there in every shared glance, every small kindness, every word left unsaid. Both carried scars, both had known loneliness and loss, but together, they were beginning to discover something neither had expected, the fragile beginnings of hope. And though neither dared to name it, the truth was simple too. Broken souls had started to mend, not through grand gestures or sudden declarations, but through the quiet, steady building of trust. The peace that had slowly settled over the ranch in recent weeks felt almost too fragile, like glass that might shatter at the slightest touch. Clara had begun to laugh, again quiet, hesitant, but real. Elias had started to feel the heavy weight of loneliness lift, little by little, replaced by something he hadn't dared to hope for, companionship. But the world has a way of testing the good things, of sending shadows to chase the light. It began with whispers in town. Elias rarely went, but on the rare supply trips, he noticed the way people eyed Clara when she accompanied him. Women nudged each other, men smirked or let their stares linger too long. Small towns thrived on gossip, and a woman with no family name, no past she cared to share, was bound to stir talk. Clara sensed it too. She lowered her gaze, kept close to Elias, and said nothing, but her silence carried unease. She had lived long enough to know that where gossip began, trouble often followed. That trouble arrived one hot afternoon. Elias was out in the far pasture, checking the fence line when he heard the sound of approaching horses. Dust rose in the distance, and his heart tightened. Visitors out here were rare, and uninvited ones never carried good news. By the time he reached the yard, 3 men had ridden up to the ranch house. Clara stood frozen on the porch, her hands gripping the railing as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The men dismounted, their boots crunching against the dry earth, and Elias immediately caught the sharp, dangerous edge in their eyes. Well, the tallest one drawled, his voice carrying a cruel familiarity. "Thought you could run, Clara?" Elias glanced sharply at her. Clara's face had gone pale, her lips pressed tight, her eyes wide with fear. That single look told him enough. These men weren't strangers to her. They were part of the past. She'd only half revealed the one she had tried so hard to escape. The leader stepped closer, spitting into the dirt. "She belongs with us." She ran off, thinking she was too good to stay where she was put. "But we came to collect her." Elias' jaw clenched, his hand flexing near his belt, though no weapon hung there yet. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he said evenly, his voice low but firm. "She's not going anywhere with you." The man sneered. "And who are you to say so? Some lonely rancher thinkin' he can keep what ain't his." Clara's voice broke in then, trembling but steady enough to carry. "I will not go back. With you, not ever." The second man laughed harshly. "Hear that? She's been here too long, thinking she's got choices now. But we know the truth, don't we, Clara?" Clara flinched, shrinking back against the porch post. Elias stepped forward, his body a wall between her and the men. His chest rose and fell slowly, his stance calm but coiled like a spring. For a moment, silence pressed heavy. The prairie wind hissed through the dry grass. The horses shifted restlessly, and Clara's breath came in shallow bursts. Then Elias spoke again, his voice edged with steel. "You'll turn your horses around and leave. She doesn't owe you anything, not now, not ever." The leader's smile twisted into something sharp and mean. "Or what? You'll fight us all yourself. Don't be a fool, rancher." Elias didn't move, didn't flinch. "Try me." The words hung in the air, not shouted, but heavy with conviction. The kind of conviction men recognized, the kind that made them hesitate. Clara's eyes filled with tears, not of fear this time, but of something else. No one had ever stood for her like this. No one had looked her tormentors in the face and said she was worth protecting. The standoff stretched, the tension like a rope pulled taut. Finally, the leader spat again, his gaze burning into Elias. "This ain't over," he growled. "We'll be back. You can't keep her forever." With that, the men mounted their horses, wheeled them around, and thundered off, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. When the silence returned, Clara's legs gave way, and she sank onto the porch steps, trembling. Elias turned immediately, crouching beside her. His rough hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "They won't touch you again," he said quietly, his voice carrying the steady certainty of a promise. Clara looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes. "You don't understand. They will come back. They always come back." Elias' gaze held hers, steady and unyielding. "Then I'll be here when they do." For the first time in years, Clara felt something stronger than fear. She felt safe. And for Elias, standing there with her in the quiet aftermath, the truth settled deeper than ever. This wasn't just about protection anymore. Somewhere along the way, the fragile thread between them had become something unbreakable. The ranch no longer felt the same after that day. The men's visit had left a shadow across the land, heavier than the storm clouds that sometimes rolled over the prairie. Clara moved quietly, always glancing toward the horizon, as if expecting dark figures to ride over the ridge. Elias could see the way her hands shook when she fed the chickens, the way her eyes darted at the sound of distant hoofbeats. Elias carried the weight of it too, though he hid it better. He worked longer hours, mended fences that hadn't needed mending, sharpened tools that were already sharp. In truth, his mind wasn't on the chores, it was on Clara and on the men who had threatened her. His jaw ached from how often he clenched it, and at night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound that didn't belong. He knew they'd return. Men like that didn't make empty promises. The return came quicker than he'd hoped. It was just after sunset, when the sky still glowed orange but the shadows grew deep. Clara was inside preparing supper, and Elias was stacking hay in the barn. That's when he heard it. The distant thunder of hooves, not one or two this time, but several. He stepped into the barn's doorway, his body instantly alert. Dust rose on the trail, and soon he saw them, 5 men this time, not 3, riding hard toward the ranch. Their faces were set, their eyes full of determination and malice. Elias' hand instinctively went to his side. This time, he wasn't unarmed. His rifle leaned by the barn wall, oiled and ready. He picked it up, the weight steadying him, and walked calmly out into the yard. Clara appeared on the porch, her face paling as she recognized the riders. "Elias," he whispered, her voice trembling. "Inside," he said firmly, not taking his eyes off the approaching men. But Clara, inside, his tone left no room for argument. Reluctantly, she retreated. Though the door didn't close fully, she couldn't make herself shut him out of sight. The men reined their horses, sharply, stopping just a few paces from Elias. The leader smirked down at him, his voice dripping with mockery. "Told you we'd be back." Elias adjusted his stance, his rifle cradled with easy familiarity, though he didn't raise it yet. His eyes were steady, his voice calm but edged with iron. "And I told you, she isn't going anywhere with you." The leader chuckled, shaking his head as if pitying Elias. "You think one man can stand against all of us? Rancher, you're outnumbered, outmatched, and about to lose more than just a woman." Elias' grip tightened slightly, but his voice didn't waver. "Maybe so, but you'll bleed for every step you try to take toward her." The standoff thickened. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The men shifted in their saddles, glancing at one another, gauging whether Elias' calm resolve was bluff or truth. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth behind the door, tears pricking her eyes. No one had ever stood for her like this, not with such quiet courage. The fear in her chest twisted into something else. Hope, fierce and aching. Finally, the leader snarled, "Enough talk." He jerked his chin, and 2 of the riders began to dismount. That was when Elias raised the rifle. The motion was swift, steady, and utterly sure. His voice carried across the yard, low and lethal. "First man takes another step doesn't walk away." The men froze. The leader cursed under his breath. Elias didn't blink, didn't tremble. His years of hard ranch life had honed him into something these men hadn't expected: a man who didn't bluff, who didn't bow, who would die on his land before surrendering an inch. The silence stretched. Then the leader spat again, his voice colder now. "This isn't over, rancher. You can't watch her every hour of every day. Sooner or later, she's ours." With that, he jerked his reins, and the men wheeled their horses around. They rode off into the night, their silhouettes swallowed by the dark horizon. Elias stood unmoving until the last echo of hooves faded. Only then did he lower the rifle. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he'd just faced down. Clara rushed out of the house, her skirts flying, her eyes wide with tears. "Elias." She threw herself toward him, her arms wrapping around his chest. For a moment, he stiffened. He wasn't used to such closeness, but then his arms encircled her, strong and protective. "I was so afraid," she whispered into his shirt. "They won't stop, they'll never stop." Elias rested his chin lightly against her hair, his voice deep and steady. "Then I won't stop either. They'll have to go through me, and that's something they'll never do." In that moment, the unspoken truth between them grew undeniable. This wasn't just a matter of protection anymore, it was love, fierce, unyielding, and ready to face whatever storm lay ahead. And though Clara's fear lingered, so did her newfound certainty. She wasn't alone, not anymore. The prairie dawned quiet the next morning, but it was not the same quiet as before. There was a weight in the air, a fragile stillness after the storm of the night before. Elias rose early, as he always did, but his steps felt heavier, his mind restless. He moved through the ranch chores with practiced hands, feeding the animals, checking the water troughs, patching the gate, but his thoughts never strayed far from Clara. Inside the house, Clara was already awake. She had not slept well. Fear still clung to her, but so did something else, a strange warmth that lingered whenever she thought of Elias standing tall against those men, rifle in hand, his voice steady as iron. No one had ever claimed her safety with such certainty before. It wasn't just protection he had offered, it was belonging. She watched him from the window as he crossed the yard, his shoulders squared, his stride purposeful. He looked every bit the rancher, weathered and strong, yet she had seen the softness in his eyes when he held her last night. That contrastial and gentleness had wrapped around her heart and refused to let go. At breakfast, they sat across from one another at the worn wooden table. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was thick with unspoken thoughts. Elias cleared his throat finally, setting his fork down. "Clara," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "last night proved something we can't ignore. Those men aren't going to stop, and you—" We paused, struggling to find the right words. "You deserve more than running and hiding. You deserve a life, a home." Her hands tightened around the mug she held. "But where? They'll follow me anywhere. If I stay here, I'll bring trouble to you. I can't bear that, Elias. I can't." Elias leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "Trouble's already here. But listen to me, I don't want you gone, not because I pity you, and not because I feel it's my duty. I want you here because this ranch hasn't felt alive until you stepped on it." His voice softened, rough edges giving way to raw truth. "I want you here because He faltered, then pressed on. "Because I care for you." Clara's breath caught. For so long she had felt invisible, unwanted, a burden. To hear those words, it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she could only stare at him. The silence stretched again, but this time it was charged with something new, something fragile and beautiful. Clara set her mug down, her hands trembling slightly. "Elias," she whispered, "I've been running for so long I forgot what it felt like to want to stay. But here, with you, I don't feel like I'm surviving. I feel like I'm living." Her voice broke, but she pushed on. "If you'll have me, if you truly mean those words, then yes, I'll stay. Not out of fear, not because I have nowhere else, but because this feels like home, because you feel like home." Elias' chest tightened, a warmth spreading through him like he hadn't known in years. He reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers. The contact was simple, but it sealed something deeper than words could touch. "You're not just staying, Clara," he said firmly. "You're mine. This land, this house sits as much yours now as it is mine. And no man alive will take you from it." Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sorrow. This time they were tears of release, of finally belonging. That evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon and painted the prairie in hues of gold and fire, they stood together outside the ranch house. Clara leaned into Elias' side, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. The air smelled of hay and earth, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. For the first time in years, Clara felt no fear at the sound. She had found her place, her safety, her love. Elias looked down at her, the glow of the fading sun reflecting in his steady eyes. "We'll face whatever comes," he murmured. "Together," Clara smiled softly, resting her head against him. "Together," she echoed. And in that moment, the wandering woman and the weary rancher made their choice not just to endure the hardships of the prairie, but to build something greater than either had ever known, a home, a future, a love that no shadow could overcome.